live transcript, enable, and we'll record here as well. Excellent. So there is a script. You will see me following a script, but it is intended to be a conversation. So thank you again for agreeing to be part of this one-on-one interview. As you know, the aim of the interview is to hear more about your experiences within the domains of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. Your participation in the interview is voluntary, and at any point you'd like to step out, take a break, pause, end early, just let me know. We can absolutely do that. As you know, these interviews are recorded for the purposes of generating a transcript that will be anonymized, so no names or identifiers will be kept. I know you've read through the consent, but do I have your consent to start?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Before we get started, do you have any questions for me?
No.
Sounds good. So for the record and logistics, can you please state your age, your preferred pronouns, and your role at the Cancer Center?
47. My preferred pronouns are she, her. I've already forgotten what else you asked me.
Your role at the Cancer Center.
Role at the Cancer Center. I'm a medical oncologist. I also have a leadership role as the head of the Department of Clinical Trials.
Beautiful. So the first question that I'm asking, it will be to ask you to define or explain 3 specific terms, and we'll go through each of them in turn. Mm-hmm. So the first one is, how would you define or explain to someone the term equity?
From my perspective, equity is trying to ensure that patients have equal opportunity. So, one thing that comes to my mind where maybe we struggle a bit with equity is, each of our different physicians views how they do their day job very differently. And what I might offer a patient might be different than what a colleague of mine might offer a patient. And my advantage is often in clinical trials where there's clearly differences, where we have some faculty members, even though it's an academic institution, who will never offer a patient a clinical trial. And then there are some people who offer clinical trials at least once a day in their daily practice. In my mind, that is a gap in equity. Each patient should have an equal opportunity to have all the different appropriate treatments made available to them. So it's trying to keep an even playing field when otherwise you don't have an ability to advocate otherwise.
Sure. In the same breath, how would you define or explain the term diversity?
Diversity, I think, has multiple facets to it because, there's diversity on all sorts of different domains, right? And the list could go on and on. There's diversity in age. I actually just approved an article for Clinical Trials Week, and they were looking for a patient story. And I presented them a patient who is 89 and is participating in a therapy trial.
Oh, wow. And
I brought him forth as evidence of diversity, right? And equity in many ways, right? In 2 different idea sets. Because when we do our day jobs, we need to think about how do we translate what we know from very controlled research to our day-to-day. And if we don't have people who represent walks of life, including age, right, then how do we interpret that data in light of and what we do in our day-to-day? So I brought him up as evidence of not only can we treat 80-year-olds, but we can treat 80-year-olds on clinical trials, and we can do it successfully with good quality.
Yeah.
So, the idea of, diversity really depends on what you're looking at from an angle. There's diversity in age. There's diversity in gender. There is diversity in often sort of life experiences, people who've grown up urban, people who've grown up rural, in socioeconomic status, and which advantages from that perspective. People's different race, ethnicity, those types of even just life experiences. If if you haven't tried to seek out people who potentially may look at the problem in different ways, you may not be creating solutions that potentially are as able to be brought to the masses as if you've got sort of a one vantage.
So really looking beyond the skin deep layer and really appreciating the multitude of ways that people can impact a solution, but also where they're coming from.
Absolutely.
And so lastly, how would you define or explain inclusivity or inclusion?
Oh, again, it's trying to provide opportunity, right? Trying to make it such that you don't make the hurdles so high that people aren't able to be able to have their voice, right? You look at some of these things around leadership positions, and like the classic is they hold these meetings at 7 a.m. And so how are you going to get female leaders who might have other family responsibilities that they're going to say no if they know that means that they can't get their kids on the school bus. So you have to provide opportunities so that that truly the entire group could feel welcome.
That everyone has a space at the table, knowing that they have different needs coming to that table.
Yeah, it doesn't do you any good to try to seek diversity if you don't have the vantage on inclusivity and what it might take for somebody to be able to show up to the table.
It's more than acknowledging difference. It's about how do you make space for it. So keeping those concepts, those definitions in mind, partially a black and white, do you see these domains influencing patient-clinician interactions? And if so, in what ways?
I do. Like I said, I described it a little bit in sort of opportunities for people to be able to experience the breadth of healthcare, right? And it is God, there's just so many different ways where it can be a struggle if I look at even just simple things like equity, right? And, patients who potentially have a bit more educational background, they're the ones who can figure out how to work the system to be able to get my email and reach out to me that way, to survive, to get to call the call center. And eventually, people just stop bothering, right? So there's all sorts of different aspects of equity. I was thinking about a patient that I had with one of my residents in their longitudinal clinic. And to be honest, like when you if you just met him in passing, you would have thought he was a jerk. You would have absolutely thought like he would just get angry and, like if you were behind, Then if you actually sat down and talked to him, he has a disabled child at home, and every minute he's spending here is time that child may not be supervised in the best way possible. And so, yes, there was many stressors around this person and their own personal cancer diagnosis. But this guy was missing treatments, because we couldn't accommodate the schedule that he needed to make it work for his family. So I think we have some major issues that are in healthcare around, equity, right? If you want to actually try to continue your day job, we do not offer before or after work opportunities for chemotherapy infusions or appointments. There's no weekend options. So I think there's struggles from that perspective. There's struggles around the bias around gender. I honestly lost my mind a few weeks ago when I got one more email from one of my referring physicians and said, "Hey, Roz, I would like you to see this patient. They're a bit rough around the edges, but their family's nice. They need your your care, to make things through. And I used to take it as a compliment that they thought that the care that I delivered was
superior,
was at a bar but I've realized that, when I'm the one who accumulates all of these challenging patients, and for better or for worse, many of these patients, because of issues around access to care, are presenting late. They're sicker when they get here. They're not as well. So they're not a candidate, whether I thought they were a candidate for a clinical trial or not, they may not have the ability to even envision how they could participate in research. And so therefore, like, I'm losing out on opportunities to recruit to the clinical trials that I value so much, because I'm taking on the cases where I feel in my heart I'm doing the right thing. I'm taking the consultation on the person who doesn't have tissue, because I need to talk them through what it really means to have a lung cancer diagnosis and how tissue might help them get to a treatment. So like I said, there's struggles around some of these different things as well. If you get random digit dial doctor, it's very interesting on how things work. And I sit here and I look at, like, I was answering emails until 1 a.m. last night as I was trying to cover getting drug access, because we're short staffed from that perspective. We don't have enough secretarial support to be able to help prepare to get oral agents or to do anything. So there are patients where the doctors there's some people who just let the system work for them. And if that's not fast enough for the patient, so be it. And then there's others who, I'm killing myself slowly because I treat patients like I would hope that someone would treat my family member. But in the current model that we exist upon, it's not sustainable.
No, no, you can't set yourself on fire for every person. Now, acknowledging all of those things, thinking back through your training, had you ever received any formal or informal training or teaching in regards to EDI within the clinical setting, or anticipating what your role was going to be as an oncologist?
I don't remember anything when I was in training. It's become more of a thing now. Like, I attended this year's CAMO meeting, and there was some wonderful educational lectures on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and it's been a topic at ASCO. So it's become much more of a talking point for some big organizations, and I think that's great, because it has given people the opportunity to broaden their horizons. If I look at myself, it still blows my mind at how I've managed to get to where I am, right? Like, diversity in my hometown was Protestant versus Catholic, right? There was a single African-American person in my hometown. He had married a white woman. He was a physician. He led the choir. Right? Like, wow. I did not meet I did not have a friend who wasn't white until I went to university. I didn't meet someone of a non-Christian faith until I went to medical school. And so I sit here now and I look at the world in which I live, and I sit here and, like, I was reflecting after the CCTG meeting and thinking about, how are we doing with outreach with respect to providing access to clinical trials to people of different walks of life. And I was sitting there thinking about the patients that I see many of my trials patients on Wednesday mornings, and I was just going through the list. And I'm like, I've got an African-American male. I've got a Muslim Middle Eastern patient. I have an Aboriginal woman, just on the people that I saw the other day. Right. And I'm like, it was funny. The better part of it is I don't even see that.
Yeah.
Right. I just see that these are my patients on clinical trials. And we were talking about outreach to Aboriginal patients and how we could do a better job. And I am a bit sensitized to that after doing my training at Hopkins, where Hopkins did some very bad things back in the day. If you haven't read, oh goodness, okay, I've got a book for you to read. It's the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks or something along those lines. Have you read that book?
No, but I've heard the story.
Oh, yes. You read the book.
Yeah.
Read the book. I'll see if I can find it. It was the only book that I ever actually picked for book club. There was a lot of sketchy things that happened back in the day, where patient consent was not something that was part of the vernacular. But I had, actually, here you go. This is,
squish.
Yeah. So this is, what's his name? Patches. This is Patches.
Very cute.
Patches was a gift to me on a first follow-up appointment when a African-American man came to see me for his first oncology appointment. And he brought Patches to me because Patches is a guinea pig.
Yes.
And he wanted to thank me for not making him feel like a guinea pig in my clinic. And so this is where Patches has come from.
That's so sweet. That's so sweet.
But that's what people are afraid of, right? They're afraid that they're just going to get sucked into the bowels of the hospital. Like that is a real thing. And it's a fascinating walk of life there because you have people who have lived the streets of Baltimore, and then you have people who've flown up from across the ocean to get the same care. So it's a very bizarre mixture of things. And I definitely, I grew up after coming out to the East Coast and really getting through experience.
Yeah.
People who have really walked lives that are very different than the ones that my shoes have trod.
Right.
But it's, I'm just trying to think of what opportunities I would have had. Like if I look at I went to Catholic medical school, so just to put that in perspective. Yeah, I went to Georgetown. Georgetown's a Catholic medical school.
I didn't know it was Catholic.
Oh, for sure it is. And so it's very interesting, right? Because they actually, the university proper and the university hospital proper follows all the Catholic rules and regulations, right? We did all of our obstetrics in the community hospitals.
Interesting.
So I still am. I will never forget my first year medical school. All books the first semester. Second semester they start letting us do sort of just observations.
Like seeing people.
You got it, right? So I get sent to one of these community hospitals. I'm doing OB-GYN clinic. My preceptor is in the OR that day. So they scooch me in. I walk in, my preceptor looks up, stops the vacuum, and she's like, points to the tubing of the vacuum. She's like, see that? Those are the products of conception. I was like, wow, right? Like, here. Okay.
World rattled.
I was like, oh my goodness. Like I said, this is coming from the person, and I can't believe I'll say this on your little recording, whose, mother the night before the wedding came to make sure that I knew what might be coming that next day at the age of 22. Right?
Horrifying.
So, right, wonderful conversation where she's just checking in. She's like, okay, we should probably talk, right? Age of 22. Age of 22.
Really,
we've been a very sheltered life.
Yeah, fair. But horrifying. I never want to have that conversation.
Well, I was able to be like, we're good, Mom. That was basically yep.
At school, they covered it. We're good. Nope. You don't need to know anything more.
I got it covered in OB-GYN clinic in Georgetown.
Yep.
But that was the first time that I actually, just because of the diversity of Washington, D.C., we not only went to clinics at these community hospitals, but community hospitals were in Northern Virginia, and a very, very diverse population there. So some of the clinics that I went to as a medical student, almost all exclusively Spanish speaking. So I was given my little book of questions that I would ask patients in Spanish. I would read my card, and it was like flujo vagina. And as long as the answer was no, we were good. As soon as the answer was sí and I'm like, un momento, por favor, and I would go get somebody who can actually speak Spanish, and I would come in.
Wow.
Yeah, right? What a bizarre way to provide healthcare when I don't even actually speak the language of the other person. I'm asking all my questions, praying that they say no.
What was the question?
Like it was like abstract, like prenatal visits, right?
Right. What was the first question?
Any blood from your vagina, any like that, fluid from the vagina was fluid vagina, sanguine vagina, right?
Mm-hmm.
Was like blood from anyway, like I could read my little questions.
Oh, thank goodness.
I know, right? Like, welcome to delivery of healthcare, right?
Well, so it's interesting. So clearly a lot of it was, like you said, hitting the ground running and learning through doing and exposure and like having to learn because you had to learn. But then you also said that more recently, like in oncology, opportunities to seek out these narratives, these conferences, these sessions. But is that something that you were told that you needed to do? Is it something that you sought out of your own volition? And if you did, why?
No, so it's not something that I've been told to do per se. I'm trying to think back because I've also done some leadership training through the university. And there's sessions that were embedded in that around equity, diversity, and inclusion, recognizing that if you're going to be one of the next leaders from a university perspective, they want to understand that they want to know that you've had exposure and recognize the challenges that come through these different things. But it's been a very interesting place, right? Like, we're coming along even with just gender diversity within our division, but it's still a very different balance of the biggest of the leaders are all still white males, right? And the struggle with the white males who lead continue to be that, the answer to the problem is to do more, as opposed to, think smarter, not harder, right? I think that's part of the struggles when you lack in equity, diversity, and inclusiveness, right? If you don't have an inclusive table, I think this is where inclusiveness comes through. The person who can't come to the 7 a.m. meeting can't also express, well, here's how you could do it so that you could make it, logical, or, you don't get people who come with unique vantages on problem solving, right? If you solve the problem by, just booking more clinics or, taking extra patients or, seeing more disease sites or whatever it is, it can't be the way forward. There's got to be better ways to maximize productivity. And so sometimes it does take someone who's come from the outside. Sometimes that's the diversity, right? Is people who have trained from other places versus trained from here who have seen other ways of doing things, right?
So I guess in that earlier tangent, you said that you were never told that you had to do it, that you sought out these opportunities. Yeah. What prompted the desire to put yourself in that space, imagining that it could be an uncomfortable learning edge,
Well, that's embarrassingly so, I'm the odd one out in my family, right? So it's made for some very hard maneuvers. My vantage on how I want to live my life, who I want to surround myself, and how I view everything from people of different sexuality choices to people of, again, that have come from different parts of the world or have different religious backgrounds or the like. I have no idea how I've kind of ended up with the mindset that I have. It does not reflect the mindset of the people who have reared me. And so that's made things a little bit challenging. And I'm not this is the struggle with some of these different things is I'm not the most confrontational person on the planet. So I'm much more likely to just talk about the weather rather than talk about these other things because I have a limited opportunity to get to spend time with some of these people and I do love them very much. And I have zero faith that I'm going to change them, nor do I, for better or for worse, they live in an environment where changing them won't change anything because they're not faced with these things. They get, when you never get an opportunity to see anything besides what you see on the television news,
Yeah.
How do you ever truly get an understanding of people from different walks of life, right?
Was it, thinking back, was it ever a point where it was hard or uncomfortable or something that you didn't want to engage in to be faced with the reality that things were different than how you had perceived the world previously?
Well, like I said, I definitely know that I grew up in a very different way than many others. And I sit here and I look, because I realize that I come to the world with my own biases, right? Mm-hmm. And whether I like these biases or not, they're there, mm-hmm. right? I would be lying if I told you that I don't get annoyed when people don't have the same work ethic that I do. You know, do I begrudge them for it? Not so much, but do I still at some point I'm like, I still find myself every once in a while like, okay, I've had to suck it up and do X, Y, or Z. You know, why? Well,
like keep up,
right? Like it. You just have to stop and think. There was I forget what it was. Like again, some group I was in. Oh, I think it might have been I belonged to a physician moms group on
mm-hmm,
Facebook.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I was reading a post about, you know, trainees of now versus trainees of the past. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've so been there, right? Mm-hmm. Where this person posted and said, what would you do with this, mm-hmm. right? My resident texted me this morning saying they just didn't sleep very well, so they're not coming in around today. They don't have COVID, but they'll be feeling better tomorrow, so they're going to come in and they'll be back to work the next day. See, you did it too, though, right? And I'm like, God, that's a really shitty excuse, right? Like, I still remember the day that, like, one of my favorite residents of all time was supposed to be working with me in clinic, and I got a message from this person that said, hey, I am supposed to be working with you today. I'm really sorry. I'm giving half day today, and I didn't finish my talk until 1 a.m, and I'm just wiped, and I just can't come to your clinic. Meanwhile, that exact same day, I was working on a grant. I didn't actually sleep at all. So I've been up all night. I'm now going to run this clinic by myself. And this person had said, you know, I'm not sure that I'm safe to be managing patients today. I have only had 5 hours of sleep or whatever it was. And so I was like, I'm like, get some rest. Good on you. And I literally just told my nurse, I'm like, okay, I'm not sure that I'm so safe today because I haven't slept. So you need to double check what I'm doing and make sure that I'm not making stupid errors. Mm-hmm. Please help me to be my best self today. I don't have any help beyond the two of us. And so on one side, I'm like, oh, really? Like, couldn't you suck it up? And on the other side, I'm like, God, I'm also a little jealous. Like, I wish that I could just, you know, say, you know, my lack of planning for, you know, my presentation has affected my ability to work with you this day. I'm just not coming today.
Yeah.
But then, you know, somebody makes a very good point, right? Like someone might be making, like, again, I don't look at things this way because I've never had this happen to me, right? Mm-hmm. And a woman posted on this feed and she was like, please give this person pause. You don't know why they might be making this shitty excuse. It's possible their partner beats them. It's possible that, you know, like things that I have had the good fortune that I have never had a domestic partner who has ever tried to harm me. Mm-hmm. But that's not the life experience of everyone, right? You know, people who suffer with addiction issues where they're having to compensate for things, or a loved one who may be going through their own thing and they're not ready to share that there's a problem. And you forget that people do have lives outside of medicine. And, it's just one of those moments where all I did was look at it as a shitty excuse for why they weren't showing up to help the team. And you forget that someone might be too embarrassed to tell you what really is going on. And this is the best that they can do that day. And the problem is if we only select people for medicine who fit the, I've never touched a cigarette. I've never considered drugs. I drink no alcohol. I exercise every day. I've never had food insecurity. I've never had housing insecurity. then how do we represent things for our patients?
Yeah.
Right? How do I ever, I know that I can't walk in the shoes of many of my patients. And so, this is why I seek some of these things out or try to expose myself to these things, is to be able to see things from a different light, have people explain to me where, maybe I should be looking at things differently or hear things from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that vein then, is there a recent anecdote or example of a clinical encounter that you were part of or witnessed where those specific domains, so like something to do with a diversity, difference, an equitable issue, an inclusivity issue, really impacted that clinical encounter, whether it was establishing patient trust, how they were willing to make a decision or anything along those lines? Is there something that really stands out as an anecdote? Oncology would be ideal.
No. I know, but like I'm thinking about it. I could think about a couple of things yesterday, right? The people that I work with, right? I have surrounded myself and have been very fortunate to have wonderful people who have chosen to do additional training alongside me. Person has gone in to see patient. Patient is clearly economic performance status 3, have been over how, the diagnosis and and there's a son who's there. There's concerns around health literacy, et cetera, and literally laid into this resident around, why can't you show me the images? Why can't, this is substandard care if I can't see the CT scans. It becomes very confrontational with this person, even though they've gone through all the different bits and pieces and trying to hold your stuff together. And so here I come in, the gray-haired lady, right? And somehow I say all the same things and they're like, oh, okay. Right? So there's an age bias, right? Where the staff person, even though they say the exact same words as the junior person, it doesn't get accepted. I see the same thing from a gender perspective. Like, I think I've told you this before, but like, I have actually had a commentary in a career review that one way that I can make myself more efficient is to talk less. And if I talked less to patients, then I would be faster.
That's infuriating.
Let me tell you, what people don't appreciate when they come from different walks of life sometimes is, one, I have never been in a position to provide healthcare from a paternalistic point of view. I do not tell patients, this is what you're going to do. I provide patients options, I provide risks and benefits, and then it's shared decision making from there. And if they tell me they want me to help choose the one that I think is best, I will guide them, but I'm not going to tell them what to do. That takes a lot longer than telling them, this is what we're going to do for treatment, here it is. You don't get to hear any options, including the option of doing nothing, which actually takes longer to talk somebody through than doing something. And so it gets very frustrating when, I'm here late because I feel like I need to deliver care in the way that I want to. It takes me longer than someone who's just going to come in and say, this is how it's going to be done. So I just sit here and I look at, I get to see, I walk the walk as someone who, I didn't even understand growing up that I always thought that we were less fortunate, right? I didn't get designer clothes. My mom sewed most of my clothing. My mom sewed my prom dresses. We didn't have the latest and greatest. We didn't have video games. We had a family television. I thought that was the difficult, way to grow up. What a putz I am, right? Like, you don't realize that there's some people who, God forbid, like they're stretching, food and having to buy things or go to a food, like never was I ever in that circumstance. There was food on the table. I was never running around naked, right? I am, my family that I thought was poor, right? Like I was on scholarship and all that kind of stuff because we didn't have the money to pay for me to go to fancy school. So I had to earn it myself, but by no means. When I have now seen what truly some people live through, and people who do not have a home, or people who do not have meals on a regular basis, right, live through. So, you've got to realize these things as you move along, where you look through, and you realize really what hardship truly is when you start to get to see people who are different from yourself and what people have truly gone through. But I was sitting in clinic, and the thing that differentiates me, I have never been poor, right? In the true sense of poor, right? I have the benefit of being Caucasian and all the, straightforwardness that comes along with being somebody of white background. But I have had the challenges of what it's like to be a woman in healthcare, and being a woman in healthcare is the easiest path. I was up until dark 30 last night because I was so upset at the way my clinic ended yesterday. I was running behind. I had 2 new patients, 2 care plans, all of whom needed therapy plans put together. 2 of them were 2 news, both metastatic disease. So my rule of thumb is that when I do new diagnosis of metastatic disease, I not only talk about disease, but I start goals of care. Because your clinic visits only get shorter and shorter from there. So if you haven't opened the door here, the likelihood that I'm going to open it at a 15-minute time slot is just small. So these appointments take me a while, right? To talk through the diagnosis, the prognosis, the goals of care, what the patient is interested in, what the treatment options may or may not be, consent, all this kind of stuff. So I had 2 new metastatic patients. I had 2 more patients who were care plans, both who finally I had the biomarkers back to be able to do so. One of those 2 patients, we thought maybe we were going to treat with curative intent. We have now discovered we're not going to be treating with curative intent, so I had to basically start all over. But that was the last patient of the day. And I had only finished the first 3 patients at 5 p.m. The nurse who I was working with had to leave. She had already called to see if there could be coverage. And the nurse who was going to help me shows up at 5 o'clock, well, Madeline, you got to get out of here, right? You've got to pick up your baby. Your baby needs you. Do you really need me? And this person has their coat and their bag as they walk into the clinic. Do you really need me? And what sucks is you've now put me in a very awkward position because you've clearly declared that you're not interested in being here. I am a person who, for better or for worse, isn't great at delegating at the best of times. I don't want to inconvenience anybody, but I also know it's the right thing to do to not leave me in a clinic by myself with someone who's on 3 liters of oxygen, who's just been discharged from hospital, who I'm trying to put together a care plan for. So my gut says, let this person go, because I don't want to create conflict, and clearly this person doesn't want to be here. So if she doesn't want to be here, I don't want her to be here, so go. But I was frustrated enough at the moment that I said, you can go. But let me tell you why I asked for someone to be here. I've been in a circumstance where I've walked into a care plan when someone has left me, and there's an angry person there because they don't like what's going on with their cancer diagnosis. And I get trapped in a room and there's nobody there to worry that I haven't shown back up, right? Or I've been in a circumstance where someone's oxygen has run out and they're standing at 80%. And where do I find the tanks, or how do I get this person home? What am I going to do? And I have no one to help me because the building is empty. And this has happened to me. And this is why I asked for a nurse to stay here for support. I'm like, the patient needs the nursing care. And to be honest, I shouldn't be left alone, right? They're like, oh, well, now I feel guilty. That was what they said. So at this point, while all this is going on, I'm grabbing all the things that I need, and I go into the room and I do my thing, right? I come back out. That nurse will not speak to me. I eventually say, hey, I'm done with my portion. Can you please do the nursing aspects of education on immunotherapy? Well, I don't use that. Can you at least talk to them about management of other aspects of their cancer care. She's on hydromorphine twice a day. She's only having bowel movements every couple of days. Can you please let her know how she gets a hold of us? It's really important for patients to know how to get a hold of us when we're doing immunotherapy, and off they go, right? And so it was not the ideal end of the day. Mm-hmm. And then not only that, so I'm upset about it, right? Yeah. So what do I do when I do these things? I write things down and I write it out, and sometimes that just makes me feel better to express it onto a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. And then I get an email from this nurse at 11 p.m. saying that I was disrespectful to her and that I did not welcome her into the clinic. I did not use her to her abilities, and that I should be better at delegating. And I just sat there. And I'm like, this only happens to a woman. This only happens to a woman who has asked for what the patient deserves. A physician should not be left with patients in rooms with no support. Mm-mm. And I get it. We're all tired. And I get it. You want to go home. But I'm sorry. My kids want their mom home too. And when I have to do things all by myself and I have to do every aspect of the patient's care, no matter what my level of background is, my kids lose out too. My husband loses out on these things. Mm-hmm. The patient loses out because they don't have appropriate nursing care. And I'm just trying to imagine that if I didn't have 2 X chromosomes, would they really have emailed Peter Ellis and said, hey, did you really need me? You were not as respectful. Would they really have? And I just sat there and I wrote back and I'm like, I am sorry. I was not necessarily my best self and I was frustrated. And I'm sorry I wasn't thinking about your education and inviting you. I'm like, I guess I could have been better and I could have invited you into the room and you could have learned something about immunotherapy from the way that I teach, because I'd like to think that I actually teach well. I'm sorry that you were offended by the way that I do things. And I'm sorry I don't delegate better, but I realize my own failings and I realize I've got quirks. And to be honest, I don't want to use you as a paper pusher. I want to use you for your nursing skills. So I didn't feel it was a great use of either of our time for me to have to explain to you how I like things done. So I figured I could do the paperwork myself, but I wanted you here for that patient education piece. How many times have, like I said, super frustrating. At least she had the guts to send a note to me, because I've also been on the receiving end of a nurse not happy with how I approach something. And instead of talking to me about it, reports me to my boss. Those are the things that I get to see when it comes to, equity, diversity, inclusiveness, yeah. Right? Is, this place doesn't make it easy to be a female physician who tries to do all the things that they're supposed to do, without yet disturbing anyone in there.
Have you noticed any changes in the culture in the last number of years?
Like I said,
or has it been pretty stagnant?
I haven't had a chance to ask other female providers what their experience has been. I've been through a slew of nurses, right? Mm-hmm. This nurse might be my 6th nurse in the 12 years that I've been here.
Good gosh.
Well, there was like a revolving door at the very beginning, and then I consistently was Margaret, and then they decided to switch that up with the new model of care change. And so I don't know, right? COVID has taken away so much of what I consider the wonderful parts of the collegiality of this place, right? Like, you only get to see the small little pockets of people who you work with in the clinics, and otherwise we now work out of our homes, or we try to stick to our offices. We don't mingle. We don't go out after hours anymore. Not that there was that much of it before, but like, we don't have those moments of just social networking, that people would just vent, right? And there is some goodness,
catharsis
to that, but also it makes you feel less alone, right? when you realize that it's not just you, or, you know, the struggles with, just trying to walk the walk through a system that's underfunded, and, you know, people who are feeling underappreciated, and it's a challenging life, right?
I guess in sort of in line with that, you know, knowing that you are being conscientious and you are actively reflecting and thinking about these things when you approach patient care, especially to someone who is perhaps coming from a worldview or a life place that is very different than your own.
Yeah.
Have you been on the spectating side where you've seen someone else approach patient care and do it very wrong and do it very poorly?
Oh, but, for sure, right? So the advantage that I've seen has been more, the things that I've seen, I have not seen overt. I don't think I've seen overt racism. But sometimes you don't know it when there's subtleties to it as well, right? The things that I've seen have been more on the lines of just the approach to care, right? I have seen the paternalistic sides of things. Well, you just need to tell them this is how it's going to be. GIF comes to mind, right? It's always just such an interesting little dynamic there, where how I would approach a new patient encounter and how this team gets to approach a new patient encounter are very different beasts, right? And like I said, there's a reason why I'm still there at 6 and 7 p.m. and that other team members are done by 3:30, right? You know, life is much more simple if you provide one version of the truth, right? If there's only one version of the truth, then you don't have to talk about other realities. There's no multiverse.
True.
Yeah.
But where do you think that stems from? Is it a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding or teaching, or is it an unwillingness to bridge that gap?
Yeah. I don't know, right? Part of the struggle that I feel is patients are much more willing to challenge someone's vantage if they're not the white male. So I don't even think I could do it if I wanted to, right? Like, I think people are much less likely to, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, you know, I've not tried it, you know, I'm not quite ready to do a randomized trial of Roz just giving one option versus talking about, you know, 4. But, you know, I just, I don't know if it's just the way that you've learned to survive, right? Through different, you're the beast of the experiences that you've been through, right? I think of that when even when I talk about, Elaine McWhorter and I were chatting about, obtaining consent for treatment. And it's funny because I had this grandiose idea that we could, as a group, sort of create little templates for this fancy dancy new computer system that would cover the typical side effects of the various regimens that we give. But then I realized that we all have our own spin on how we do it. And some of us broach, like, this is having a cookie cutter something from that perspective actually could be bad, right? Because if we all as a group decided, okay, these are the things that we all cover, we all cover when we have a consent discussion, but then that's not actually how you do it. Patients now have broader and broader access to their records. You know, it's in the current environment, it's actually very challenging. People have to work really hard to get a hold of my note, right? Like, they have to really want it. And so, you know, God love for them to see what I actually said about what our interaction looked like. I think that's going to be a very interesting part of this new system. Scary, right? Well, I don't know. We'll see. Like, it's funny because I have lingo that I use. Oh, well, no, but again, you're going to have to think it through, right? Because I have created, there's just things that I do to keep myself out of trouble from a clinical trials perspective, right? And it's funny because like I started getting taught lingo back the very first days of me taking my first faculty position at Hopkins. They actually gave you language that would get you extra points for billing in your dictations.
Oh.
And they would review your dictations to show you how you could have done things differently so that you could have billed more for your encounter.
Interesting.
Welcome to the United States vantage of things, where MDUs, anyway, make it how the university gets paid or the hospital system gets paid. When I think about when I do things with clinical trials, there's multiple cooks in your kitchen, and ideally you want to have a single source documenting a particular aspect of the care. That's what's going to be a little bit interesting with this new system is how we blend these different things together. So my dictations are extremely light on the subjective side because I just will say, please see the accompanying dictation by my trials nurse or coordinator, such and such, for the details of the adverse events associated with today's visit. I'll do the objective stuff and I'll give an ECOG and I'll give a weight, but then I have a line, right? Because clinical trials, if you look at the schedule of events, will say that there's a full physical exam or a symptom-directed physical exam. So if somebody doesn't have any new symptoms, that basically means I don't have to do a physical exam. So that is my line. There are no symptom-directed physical exam findings today. There weren't any symptoms to direct any physical exam findings.
There's no reason to do it.
Right. So I don't say that I didn't do a physical exam. That sounds bad. It sounds better when I say there was no symptom directed. I give a general appearance or this, that, or the other, but I don't actually pull my stethoscope out for every single patient. When a patient reads that, they're probably going to be like, oh, what does that mean? She didn't listen to me. What physical exam findings?
Yeah. No.
Right? You gotta be careful, right?
Yeah, sure.
And I talk about, again, I've reviewed this lab, that lab, but those were things where, like, the language was like, I personally reviewed the labs. I personally reviewed the CT scan, right? Or whatever it was. So these things still find their way into my notes, right? My notes. There was another conversation that was funny about whether or not, I don't know if you do it. I know I totally do it. Miss Smith, is a 60-year-old lovely woman.
Oh, I say lovely all the time.
Right? And they were like, well, is there anybody who's not lovely? And how do you...
In my head, I'm like, yes, absolutely.
Right? But, it's funny, right? Should we just drop it? Right?
I've heard a compelling argument for it to be dropped because they're like, this adds nothing.
Right.
And yet it's become very much part of the stylistic manner of dictation.
Yep.
In the, thank you for this very interesting consultation.
Yeah.
Was it interesting? No. Yeah. But we'll put it in.
Yeah.
But
so.
Nevertheless. So, on the last note, as we sort of tie things up, so is there anything that we did not cover in this interview that you feel might be relevant, knowing that the research question is understanding how oncologists learn and understand the domains of equity, diversity, and inclusion?
I think that we still have yet to capture the best way for this to be taught. I think part of the struggle is people can talk about things all they want, but until you've actually had a conversation where you've been poked about some of these different things, right? Like, I will tell you, I had a moment of anxiousness when I was like, oh my God, I have to actually define these things. How do I define this? I don't know. I didn't realize I had a test.
That's the second time I've gotten that reaction.
Right? Yeah, no, but it's God, right? Like, because there's certain things where, even just thinking about applications of the treatments that we do, and people will get very persnickety about the language that's used when you're trying to define, effectiveness versus efficacy versus whatever. You're like, oh, they're kind of all the same, but they're really technically not, right? Same thing. Like some of these things all kind of get lumped together as EDI, but at the end of the day, they have different flavors of different aspects of how they blend together to an overarching theme.
How would you approach, knowing that we don't teach it, right?
Like I said, this is the thing that I find most interesting about it is, people putting out the provocative statement and then people talking about it, right? Like I said, I did nothing but get annoyed at that person saying, that they didn't sleep well, so therefore they're not coming. And I'm like, I haven't slept well in 12 years, right? And this was the same thing as this person had the staff who was being given this quote unquote excuse, right? Was like, I got 2 young children at home. I haven't slept years, right?
That instinctive reaction.
Absolutely, right? And, we don't pause to think about what that other person might be going through in that moment, right? And so, that was the only good thing about the email that I got from the nurse the other night is that she was like, I believe in giving people grace. And so she's going to give me grace in that, I wasn't my best self that day, right? I'm like, okay, sure, right? I'm not sure that she has seen my side of it, right? And why, had she come down and looked even remotely engaged, it goes a long way, right? It's no different than students. I don't know, right? Sometimes you get what you get out of some of these different interactions. I'm even just looking I had a medical student. I haven't had medical students in my clinic in the longest time, but for whatever reason, they're manifesting right now,
multiplying.
Yeah, and dang, right? There's this second-year medical student. She's been in my clinic now last week and this week. And she's supposed to be with me in the morning, but she doesn't have anything on Wednesday afternoon, so she actually sticks around and is ridiculously actually helpful. I was a little off put yesterday because this is 4th half day with me. Goes to see one of the new patients. She's like, I broached the idea of what we should do for treatment. I'm like, whoa, young lady. Right? And she wasn't wrong, right? But it was just kind of one of those things where I'm like, I get annoyed at my R4s when they want to do that, I'm like, it's one thing if we've talked about the case before you're going to go in and you already know where I'm leading.
Right. And so you are presenting a
plan that I've already given some credence to. But that was not what this was. I was like, oh, honey, okay, right? But on the flip side, though, she's been so good at
initiative, check.
Right? Well, absolutely. That I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay. It's funny because people totally beat me up hoping that I'll take them on for supervision and looking for projects and things like that. And I actually have thought about whether or not I would approach her and say, hey, you've got some chutzpah, we've got a few things that are going on. Maybe there's an opportunity for you to play in the sandbox with some of these projects that we've got going on. So, like I said, there's something about that, the way that people approach things, and how we view what's going on with folks.
It's really an openness.
Yeah.
Letting yourself be. There is a certain degree of vulnerability in that as well, right? Being vulnerable to be changed.
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing, right? Is that's what I tried to explain in my email back to this nurse last night. It was against my better nature to actually explain to you my lived experience as to why I didn't want to be left alone. And unfortunately, in that moment, to you, I probably made it sound like I wanted you to stay because of my needs, right? But at the end of the day, I didn't express myself properly. I needed you to stay because of the patient's needs. But I was not necessarily in a moment of being my best self after literally not eating, not drinking. I still have a headache today because that bottle of water was the entirety of the liquid that I drank yesterday. And so I was at that point running on the last fumes that I had, and I just wanted to power through and get this done. And if you didn't want to be here, get out, right? Yeah. But I still think it was the right thing for me to do to ask this person to stay. But it ended up losing me sleep because I was upset about the interaction at the end of the day.
Because it stays with you.
Right. Well, and again, I don't let these things fall off me particularly well. Will I confront them? No, I will not. But, like I said, I've got a whole pile of emails that I will be very carefully, I will type them, and I will not put anything in the to line, and they will sit in my drafts until I decide that the emotion has passed, and then it will get deleted.
That's a super healthy approach.
Yeah. Well, you learn from your mistakes, right? Because I can be an emotional person. I realize I can be an emotional person. Or sometimes I actually come off as an emotional person where I don't feel like I'm being emotional, but that's how people interpret how I'm being. And so I have learned a few lessons of emails that have been flipped maybe a little faster than they could have, would have, should have, to pause and give it a moment of time, right? Because like I said, when you're upset about something, the tone or whatever might come off differently, especially in the written word, because people interpret things
tone is interestingly in an email
different. And I'm wordy, right? Like, right, people. Right, a lot.
That's great. But there's something to be said about that, right? Is that, how objective and abrupt are you willing to be versus how much do you flower up an email, lest someone perceive it as being abrupt, even though it's just a dissemination of objective facts.
Yeah. Well, that's the hard part, right? It was interesting that actually there was another, welcome to the wonders of Facebook, but a gal who had a contractor, and like this contractor did all sorts of things. And so she posted a very factual descriptor on this person's, 1 star, blah, 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 blah. That person threatened to report her to the college for being unprofessional. What is her interpretation of this person's skill set as a contractor have anything to do with her medical license? But that's what this person threatened to do, right? Literally, it was like or she sued, he sued, but like it was that bad, right? Of whatever. But like literally said, give me $10,000 or I'm reporting you to the college, right?
That's blackmail.
That's exactly what somebody else said. They're like, you need to get a lawyer. This is literally
blackmail.
Yeah.
One wonders how much of that was driven by, you can't help but perceive it from the lens of like, a woman said this to you.
Oh, absolutely.
How did you perceive it? Because a woman said this to you.
Absolutely.
Versus if it was not her in her capacity with her perceived societal, power dynamic or this place that she holds and your perception of her.
Yeah.
Curious.
Well, it's funny though, right? Like it's amazing how far behind we still are, right? Like I still am annoyed after going to Rishi's wedding, and I booked the room, and it's just funny, right? Like noted, Dr. Juergens, and then blah 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 blah, and it was my wedding anniversary while we were there, and so the hotel left something of like happy anniversary. Mrs. Juergens and Dr. Ego or whatever it was, right? And they just assumed that the male in the room was the physician. And I called down annoyed, right? And I'm like, there are 2 doctors who were staying in this room and both of them are me. And I cannot believe it's 2022.
Yeah.
And you can't look on my file because I've stayed in this hotel before and figure out that the woman is the physician in the room.
But like also, if you're going to go out of your way and you're going to put titles down, either A, quadruple check that you've done it the right way, or B, forego them.
Yep, fair enough, right? Like I would have not been annoyed had it been, Mrs. Juergens and Mr. Ego. That I actually would have been fine with. You're absolutely right, right?
Right? Because had it just been.
And what sucks is like, and Kevin is so good, right? But like I was so annoyed, right? And I'm like, I don't want to slight you in any way, shape, or form. You're more than a doctor to me, and I'm not trying to slight the fact that you could have had these credentials had you so desired to stay in school longer, but I'm like,
but it's like there was inequity there, right? Like you deliberately chose to put term signifier in that order, which is incorrect, which is just like a factual misrepresentation, but also, there is something implied behind that you chose to put it that way. And it's like, was it necessary? Absolutely not. But someone made a decision.
Like, we're at the wedding of two physicians getting married, right?
Yeah. Like look at the demographic of the room. Yeah, but it is unfortunate, right? Like 2022, and it's still happening. And so it's those like entrenched not even beliefs, but patterns of thinking, right? Because it didn't come from a malicious place. It was a pattern and association that whoever wrote it down didn't check to think about. They're like, oh, well, it must be this way. It's unfortunate, truly. Let me actually pause this. I didn't realize. Stop.